Dear alumni, members of the campus community and friends, bonjour à tous. Welcome to this masterclass on the topic of COVID-19, What's the Prognosis? Presented to you by the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences during McGill's at-home homecoming 2020. My name is David Eidelman, Vice Principal of Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and your host. Je me présente, David Eidelman, Vice-Principal Santé et Affaires Médicales et doyen de la Faculté de Médecine et des Sciences de la Santé de l'Université McGill. I'm pleased to have you with us, albeit virtually, at what is a time of great renewal for our faculty. As we prepare to celebrate the bicentennial of the university, we remember that our faculty was the first to be created in 1829 and the first faculty of medicine in Canada. But we're not the same faculty as when we started out, far from it. To reflect how much we've grown, in fact, we've changed our faculty's name. We're now the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Our faculty is home to 6 schools, all leaders. School of Medicine, of course, but also the School of Biomedical Sciences, the School of Population and Global Health, the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders, the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy, and the Ingram School of Nursing, which is celebrating a landmark anniversary of its own. It's 100 years old this year. And yet, world events cast a shadow. The global COVID-19 pandemic and systemic racism are top of mind for everyone. Our faculty is committed to fighting both these scourges, and judging by the support we've received from our alumni, so are you. Last year, McGill launched Made by McGill, the campaign for our third century, and this campaign is aimed at tackling some of the key social, economic, environmental, and technological changes we face as a society. Today, that goal has become urgent. Students, staff, faculty, and alumni, we have a responsibility and a tremendous potential to meaningfully contribute to global challenges. In that vein, our special guest this evening is global health pioneer, Dr. Tim Evans. Now, you may have seen Tim on the news of late. Now, at McGill, we know him as the inaugural director and associate dean of our new School of Population and Global Health. But Tim, who has held senior leadership positions at the WHO, the World Bank, and the Rockefeller Foundation, also has an important role to play for all of Canada. He is executive director of Canada's COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, which is assessing the scope of coronavirus infection in Canada in order to inform our leaders' decision-making. If you have questions about coronavirus and about coronavirus in Canada in particular, you could do no better than to ask Tim. So with that, welcome again to all. And now I'll turn this over to Dr. Tim Evans. Tim, we're more than half a year into this pandemic. What do we know now about COVID-19 and what do we have yet to learn?
Great. Well, thanks very much, David, for that kind introduction, and welcome to everybody who's zooming into this webcast. It's a great opportunity to provide a few remarks at this time of global uncertainty, as David described, related to the pandemic and so many other issues that are upon us. But David finished by handing over to me and asking 2 questions. What do we know about COVID-19? And what do we need to know moving forward? And the answers to those can be summarized in 3 words. We don't know enough, and we need to know more. And I say this not to be glib, but simply to say that for everybody who's thrown huge energy into trying to figure out how to manage and cope with this pandemic, I think all of us, if we're honest, have been humbled and humbled on so many fronts that I'll try and speak to in some degree. But I think that sense of humility is critical because we still have, although we've learned a tremendous amount, there's still so much more that we have to learn. But let me, before moving into specifics, let me talk for a couple of minutes about the challenge of pandemics more generally. And I had the opportunity in October of 2019 to attend a tabletop simulation of a pandemic in New York. This was an orchestrated session supported by the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Global Pandemic Security had orchestrated this scenario called Event 2001. And at this event, there was this little friendly toy that was distributed. And this was the Event 2001 virus that was fast moving, that emerged in Asia and was in fact part of the coronavirus family, as you'll recognize by these spike proteins. On the basis of this, a simulation was developed, which was the fast-moving respiratory transmitted virus that began in Asia and subsequently over 4 different parts of the scenario brought the global economy to its knees, in addition to killing millions of people and creating havoc. Those who were around the table, there were 12 of us, were deemed the Global Pandemic Board, and we were to provide advice on how to get on top of this pandemic and bring it under control and mitigate the direct and indirect consequences. That was a humbling event in October 2019, and the conclusion was that we were by no means prepared to deal with a fast-moving respiratory transmitted virus from anywhere in the world. Well, in November 2019, we likely had the first case of novel coronavirus. And so we didn't have much time to incorporate learnings from that event, and we were thrown into what has become and what was declared in March as a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. I state that as background in part because first, that simulation in New York had nothing to do with the emergence of the novel coronavirus in China. But two, I think that when we think about how well we're doing or how much better we need to do, there has been a tremendous amount of energy put into thinking about how to manage pandemics. But as we've seen in the coronavirus setting, there's so much more we need to do and so much more we need to learn. So let me speak more specifically then to some of the areas where I think we've been humbled and where we think we need to learn more. The first is fundamentally with understanding disease transmission. And I think all of us assumed that transmission would happen through people showing symptoms and that everybody would be more or less equally susceptible. And what we found out is that this pandemic is transmitted by people who have very mild or no symptoms whatsoever. They don't think they're sick. That may be as much as 40 to 60% of transmission. And two, that not everybody is susceptible. And so we have an atypical pattern of transmission. This is not flu, this is not measles. This is a situation where 80% of transmission is due to 10% of cases. People who seem, for whatever reason, to be particularly able to spread the infection, whereas many people appear not to be very efficient spreaders of the transmission. So that asymptomatic and atypical transmission is one that we need to learn a tremendous amount more about. This very closely linked to understanding disease transmission is the whole area of testing. And here we've seen systemic failures in terms of testing systems being very slow to scale and not being strategic. And Atul Gawande wrote a very nice piece in the New Yorker early in September called "The Testing Mess." And in it, he identified, in the context of the United States, many of the systemic problems that are plaguing the testing side of the pandemic in the US and why it's a roadblock to really getting on top of the epidemic. It wasn't a diagnosis that was specific to Canada, but if you look at it in detail, you see many of the same sorts of issues that have been difficult in terms of mobilizing the requisite testing in the context of Canada. In general, what we need to learn to do better is how to speed up and scale up our testing systems. And we've relied very heavily on the testing for evidence of RNA or acute infection. Those tests are expensive and slow. We've really got to move those to being point of care and much faster. We need to explore some of the other testing modalities, looking at antigens, antibodies, as well as thinking about not only the swabs, but also how we can get easier samples through saliva and drops of blood. So there's a whole innovation agenda related to testing that's critical. Second is that we need to be more creative, and I think there's on the testing front in terms of early detection, and there's a McGill Professor Dominique Frignon, who's done some fantastic work in engineering around detection of coronavirus in sewage. And we've seen in many settings now that because you can find evidence the virus is shed in the stools, that sewage then becomes a public health asset, paradoxically. But in some places, they've detected coronavirus in the sewage, and that's led to much greater active testing efforts in populations where that has been found. In addition, we've seen that the virus, as I said earlier, it doesn't get everybody, but it does get some populations in particular, those that are poor, racialized minorities, and certain high-risk occupations. And so we really need to gear testing in that towards those populations much more systematically. Again, a couple of McGill colleagues, Jonathan Campbell and Dick Menzies, published a very nice piece in the Canadian Medical Association journal just this week, which looks at not only why and how testing needs to be scaled, but also why it's a very reasonable return on investment. So the testing area needs tremendous attention. On vaccines, the story's perhaps a little bit more positive. I don't think anybody who's been involved in research and development for any period of time would ever have anticipated that within 9 months, we have 9 phase 3 candidates, phase 3 clinical trials going on for vaccine candidates. Phase 3 trials are towards the end. They're the last step before we have evidence of efficacy and readiness to move the vaccines into widespread use. To do that in 9 months is testimony to tremendous capacity in the global R&D setting. There's talk that we'll have a vaccine in late 2020 or early 2021. That's enormously encouraging. However, it's very unlikely that any of these vaccines will be 100% efficacious for the entire population. And so there's going to need to be a huge amount of further work in understanding which populations are going to benefit most, which populations need to have access, and how can you make sure that vaccines are going to be, potentially multiple vaccines in settings are going to be tested for safety. There are very important global dimensions to this because the supply of vaccines won't be sufficient for everyone. And therefore, some of the efforts that are being orchestrated by the World Health Organization and Gavi related to solidarity as the basis, global solidarity as the basis for distributing vaccines are really important because it won't help if we have large parts of the world without vaccines. I'm going to shift now to the issue of treatment because as somebody who spent a long time looking at HIV and promoting development of an HIV vaccine, we're still without an HIV vaccine, yet we've developed very successful treatments. And so in the area of treatment, there's a tremendous amount going on. The very short story on it is that we found 2 treatments that work reasonably well, and we found 2 that don't. The 2 that work one is an antiretroviral, which has been shown to decrease hospitalization and save lives of people who are seriously ill. And the second is an anti-inflammatory, dexamethasone, a drug that's been around for years. And it seems also to have a beneficial impact on patients. The reasons why are not entirely clear, and that's raising a lot of interesting hypotheses about understanding the basic pathophysiology of the disease. But very importantly in science is to recognize there are things that don't work. And so contrary to what has been said at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, hydroxychloroquine does not work. And there was a very nice study led by Matt Cheng, a McGill professor of microbiology, which showed and published in the England Journal that showed that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. In addition, the antibiotic azithromycin, which is a fantastic antibiotic, also doesn't appear to have any added value. And so it's very important to keep track of the treatment space. We've seen some progress, both in terms of ruling in and ruling out some candidates, and there will be lots more evolution in that space, perhaps at a rate that decreases reliance on vaccines. A further area that I wanted to touch on beyond vaccines and treatments, pharmacologic treatments, are the non-pharmacologic interventions. And first amongst them are behavioral ones. And this really just recognizes that in the context of this pandemic, everyone, everywhere is an agent of public health. And this can't be repeated enough or emphasized enough in any message anywhere. And it's simply the recognition that soap is one of the best antivirals in the world, and most people have access to it. So washing hands makes a huge difference. So too does observing recommendations related to avoiding congregate settings and respecting social distancing suggestions. And as we've learned, we didn't know, but as we've learned through this pandemic, wearing masks actually makes a big difference. And so those are things that aren't rocket science, but if we can get good population compliance or adherence with those behaviors, it makes a huge difference. And in that respect, Canada has done pretty well, especially relative to some other countries. So I think it's important to recognize good behavior, encourage it, because it makes a huge difference and doesn't cost a whole lot. I'll move now, though, to an area where I think we've got to think more generally about systems behavior, and that's with respect to opening up of our economy, our schools, keeping our hospitals open. And here I think we have a relative vacuum of evidence. Every work site, every school is busy trying to do whatever they think might work in order to make the environment more safe. But when you look at the evidence we have for what works, whether we should have this type of cleaner or what the spacing should be of various rooms, the numbers in a room, windows open and ventilation systems, all of those things, there's a profound lack of evidence. Now, in that setting, it's hard to say one thing is better than another. But what I think we need to recognize is that these are going to be areas where there's huge investment, and we need to be informed by evidence that suggests some of these efforts are more effective or less effective. And I think this is going to be important, not only in informing how to open up and keep open the economy, but also in understanding how we can do that more efficiently. And that relates, I think, to my last point. And this really focuses on the issue of learning health systems or learning systems for health. And pandemics don't conform to randomized controlled trials that give you 5 years of prospective opportunity to understand the relative effectiveness of one intervention or another. Pandemics are very much about learning on the fly. And so we need to understand how we can bring speed, sustainability, and solidarity as 3 core functions of what is required in a pandemic response to bear through both a public health and a clinical care lens. There's an inseparability between public health and clinical care that we neglect at our peril. Or put it in another way, if we think we can do everything through clinical care, we're deluded. If we think we can do everything through public health, we're deluded. We really need to understand that they need to work hand in hand. However, if we're not investing adequately in basic public health infrastructure, if we have underfunded and under-resourced, particularly with respect to people in our public health or our care systems, be they acute or long-term care, then getting the speed and the sustainability and solidarity functions of the system is virtually impossible. So I'm going to finish by saying the most important resource we need to cultivate, and this lends itself well to the mission of our university, is people. It's people with respect to understanding the public in the context of the pandemic are perhaps the most important agents of our public's health. It's people with respect to professionals who are the ones that are serving and guiding pandemic response with knowledge, with know-how, and helping to make sure institutions perform as they should. And finally, it's people as leaders who are brave enough to understand where we're not performing well and ambitious enough to make sure that they're going to work tirelessly to find solutions that are going to allow us to move to a safer future for everyone. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was really excellent. I think that was a very insightful and well-informed overview of a very complex issue. As you said, we still have a lot to learn about COVID-19, but of course, we also have to keep going despite the fact that we don't know everything. And we have a few questions. So the first one has to do with, school. We're a few weeks into being back at school. Return to school this time is different than any other time in my lifetime, for sure. And the question on everybody's mind is, how are we doing on that front? Do we really understand how to send kids back to school safely? Are some jurisdictions doing it differently or better than others? What do you think?
So, David, it's a great question, and it's one that I haven't studied in particular, but McGill has a great epidemiologist by the name of Jay Kaufman, and he's been working with a woman by the name of Joanna Merks, and they're all over this. So I had the opportunity to chat with them in preparation, and can share a few nuggets that I extracted. First is schools are heterogeneous institutions. And this is important, not just to be pedantic to say there's a difference between preschool and university. It's recognition that the risk of transmission is different for children up under the age of puberty. We have very little understanding of transmission risk around of children or adolescents in puberty, and people, young adults or people post-puberty who are often school-going as well, seem to have transmission risks that look more like adults. So there's one, understanding that differentiation. And second is understanding how important in vivo teaching is versus Zoom teaching for those different age groups. And there's some evidence that younger people actually need to have in vivo, whereas older people are a little bit better to manage Zoom. So just to say that combination of risk and learning opportunity has to figure into this. But in terms of evidence, a study came out of Europe suggesting that schools that opened in the first wave of the pandemic were not incubators and massive transmitters of infection. So there is some evidence from Europe that that wasn't what was actually fueling the first wave, and that it didn't seem the schools were hotbeds. Having said that, as where we are now, the degree to which the wide variety of interventions that are being taken within school to minimize transmission, we don't have any evidence on how well they work. So this is an area where, as I said earlier, we're doing a lot of things, but we're sort of doing them based on what we think might work, and we're going to have to measure whether or not they are working and understand their relative effectiveness. But the other point is that we have to understand that schools are just one part of an individual's environment during the day. And there's getting to and from school, and there's after school, which are also important parts of understanding and managing the transmission risks in school-going populations. So all to say, tremendous amount more we need to learn here. Lots of efforts being made, and we're going to have active surveillance in schools to understand how well we're doing.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned the first wave, and people talk about a second wave. I'm not sure I understand how helpful this approach is, because looking around the world, we've seen different patterns in terms of spread. Some have had sustained spread, others have had clearly differentiated waves. Are we experiencing a second wave now? If we are, why? If not, why not? Does it matter whether you look at Canada, the US, elsewhere? Maybe just expand a bit on what we mean by these waves.
So I think the science on waves is not what I would call definitively defined. It's more historical reference. And if you look back to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, there you saw discrete peaks in the epidemic at different times, and those were called waves. And so what we've been through mostly in the period February through to May, many are referring to as the first peak or the first wave. And in reference to not only pandemic flu from 100 years ago, but also recognition that not everybody was infected, and there remain a significant number of susceptible individuals to infection. The risk for another crescendo in infection, another peak, remains. And people felt and have been suggesting that with fall weather, cooler temperatures that permit viral transmission a little bit more easily, and schools coming back together or opening, that might lead to a crescendo or a second wave. And we're quite vigilant about this, because the second wave of the pandemic flu, Spanish flu in 1918, was actually worse in some places relative to the first wave. So a lot of concern. In terms of where we are in Canada, Canada's done remarkably well. We have some of the lowest infection rates measured by seroprevalence of any country in the world. We're about 1% of the population that's been infected at this point in time. What that means is that, in theory, 99% of the population were not infected, and therefore remain very susceptible. If you think that 100% of the population is susceptible, but even if it's only 40% that are susceptible, that's still a very significant fraction of susceptibles that remain in the Canadian setting. And so our vulnerability to a further crescendo is very high, and that's why we have to remain vigilant. The current uptake that we're seeing is concerning. It's not crescendo, but it is an indication that we have plenty of susceptibles in the population, and therefore this virus is still very much part of our landscape. And if we're not careful, we could have a second wave, a crescendo, given how widespread the virus is in Canada this time.
Okay, it's not all entirely reassuring. But, speaking of immunity or susceptibility, one term that's been bandied about is herd immunity. And we know that some countries actually consciously try to gender herd immunity. What do we know about this concept, particularly in the context of COVID-19? And, you talked already about the base immunity in our population, but what would it mean for us to have, quotes, herd immunity in let's say, in Canada or the United States?
Yeah. So the whole idea of herd immunity is that you have enough people who've been exposed to the infection and have developed some form of protection, some sort of immune protection on the base of that exposure, that it becomes much more difficult for the virus to transmit. And it becomes so difficult that the virus really can't get beyond that reproductive rate of infecting more than one person per individual infected. And if it can't get above that ratio, then it doesn't have epidemic potential.
Right.
So the idea is that you get enough people in the population that are resistant to the infection. On the basis of the studies that we've done, and we track studies globally, the highest population seroprevalence that we're measuring, i.e. the level of immunity in the population after the first wave of infection, is on a national basis, very few countries are even at 10% of the entire population. In some areas of countries like London or New York, it's perhaps as high as 15 to 20% of the population that have shown exposure to the virus through measurement of antibodies in the blood. And so in that setting, and by that test of antibodies in the blood, there's not been great confidence engendered that, in fact, we've achieved anywhere close to herd immunity. However, One of the things that we're understanding, and this is why we have to remain humble, is that in fact there may be much more innate immunity to this virus than we had originally anticipated. And this relates to our growing understanding of cell-mediated immunity, another form which has a longer-term immunity, and some sense that there may be some protection against this virus that's been afforded by other families or other types of coronaviruses to which most of us have been exposed for a long time. Now, that suggests that, in fact, if we call that innate immunity, that's much higher than we had anticipated. And if it is much higher, then perhaps that, together with the seroprevalence or the antibody levels that we're measuring, suggests we're perhaps a little closer to herd immunity than we might have expected. However, I think although there's lots of interesting stuff on this brewing, and we're learning more every day, I think the vast majority of people believe that we're still a long way from achieving herd immunity, and which is why I think we remain so cautious and concerned about the risk of a second wave.
Makes sense. The message I'm getting is we're going to have to live with this for a while. This is not going away. And I guess one question is, what, on an individual level, I think you alluded to this in your talk, but maybe you could just expand a bit on what an individual can do to mitigate risk as we try and live with COVID-19, try and go about our business despite COVID-19.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that in some respects is that everybody's behavior is critical to this to the collective success, and therefore what you do really matters. And so that's something that I think should make people feel good. I think we should develop social apps that reinforce that sense of good behavior and encourage adherence to hand washing and safe congregate settings, social distancing, and mask wearing. Those are things that are relatively simple and, on the whole, have been taken up well. The question of their sustainability is going to be a tough one, and we've seen younger populations and even some civil society groups that are challenging some of these recommendations as assaults on their liberties or worse. And I think this is a setting where good communication and appealing to people's sense of civic duty is going to continue to be extremely important. Having said that, I think Canadians, on the basis of evidence, are doing really well. And I say that very deliberately because I think you have to give people a pat on the back and to keep them encouraged, rather than say you're not doing well enough. It's going to be a long haul. We may be lucky and get some vaccine-induced immunity in the next year, but my guess is even with that, we'll probably still be addressing this. So I think the extent to which we can get these behaviors mainstreamed and look at how to manage life with them and recognize that we can still love, congregate, and live fully is going to be part of the trick in terms of sustaining these behaviors.
Certainly are interesting times. One of the interesting aspects that you did allude to in your talk, and I think is really fascinating for people who are interested in the biology, but also in the practical aspects of the virus, is that it doesn't affect everyone the same way. So which populations are the most vulnerable to this infection, and why? And what about the differences between wealthy and low resource areas of the world or even of our society? And I guess the tough question is, what's going to be the economic impact of this pandemic of those, already who are vulnerable?
So I think I think this is a hugely important question, because insofar as all of us are at risk, some of us are much, much more at risk. And we've seen this in the mortality profile. People over the age of 80 are massively, exponentially more at risk to mortality than people under 20. So you have this this very big age differential. We know also that people that have pre-existing conditions are also, chronic disease and other immunocompromise are also at greater risk. But I think where we were surprised is to see the extent to which this disease is clustering in racial, ethnic minorities, and this is a really tough question, an important one. One is it a reflection of different underlying biological susceptibility, or is it perhaps much more likely a function of work and living circumstance, which makes transmission risk much higher amongst those communities? And I think this is an area where we have to pay much, much more attention, because insofar as risk is higher in these settings that are defined by neighborhoods like Montreal North or Côte des Neiges, or Peel and outside of Toronto, Windsor, Essex, that's where we really have to be much more aggressive on our control measures. There's also, though, you raise in the question, the international perspective on this. And we've seen, again, a very different pattern in low-income countries, where despite very high rates of infection, the mortality profile seems to be much lower. And there's some suggestions that might be undercounting. But even with the undercounting, there seems to be still a very significant difference. So there may be some cross protection from existing vaccination programs, and there's active work going on with respect to the vaccine for tuberculosis, BCG, that is actually giving us a clue on what the impact of this is. But a second part of this are what are called the indirect health consequences from shutting down the economy, from people losing their livelihoods, from not being able to make those $5 a day that are necessary to feed the family, which describes a vast majority of people living in low-income countries. The impact of the lockdown in terms of their inability to get the income they're accustomed to and to feed their family is going to lead to a food security crisis, malnutrition, and that together with less access to healthcare services suggests that people are going to die from infant mortality due to other causes, TB, malaria, HIV, because those services are no longer available or as available as they were. So there's a huge knock-on effect in terms of ill health that low and middle income countries are struggling to manage. And in that context, we may see the second wave not simply being a function of coronavirus, but a set of indirect consequences related to less access to other life-saving services, health services.
Okay, well, it's really a challenge, and I think that it's a great demonstration of how there's an interdependence between the socioeconomic realities of life and biology, and it's not always easy to predict, and it's certainly a hard problem. Part of solving the problem, though, of course, is testing. And, this is an area in which, at least in Canada, there's a lot of pressure to increase the number of tests. I think we've been doing reasonably well, but I know that there's areas to improve. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where we are with testing, especially here in Canada, maybe Canada, United States, and what role McGill and other Canadian researchers are playing in developing advances in testing.
Thanks, David. As I said in my opening remarks, this is an area where there's a huge need for improvement. And most important is sort of a strategy for scaling up and bringing innovation much more centrally to the testing challenge. There has been progress, but to be frank, it's been slow. Our federal provincial structure in Canada does not augur well for rapid strategy. And I have to say that in a setting of a pandemic, you need an aligned national strategy where all provinces and territories are marching to the same beat and moving together. 13 different jurisdictions just does not give you that efficiency. So this is an emergency and requires emergency measures, and we need to learn how to get those moving much more quickly. Having said that, I think some of the provinces are doing very well. It's not that they're not concerned, it's just that we're missing out opportunities. I mentioned the nice paper by Jonathan Campbell and Dick Menzies on scaling up our testing systems that's just come out. I think that's the sort of thinking that's required. They were looking at what the testings needed to open up the economy with our eyes open. And, you know, we're talking about opening up schools, but we don't have testing strategies that we've identified that would be efficient, acceptable, and are going to allow us to monitor effectiveness of different interventions. To me, we're wasting resources by not investing in testing. So I think McGill on that front, on the policy front, thanks to Jonathan and Dick, have done a great job. But there's also on the R&D front, a lot of activity in McGill with respect to made in Canada tests that, again, are cutting edge. They offer the opportunity not only of a market in Canada, but also a market globally. And I think this is another place where our country should be thinking much more ambitiously about positioning its knowledge assets, not only as resources for the country, but as global resources. And the state of R&D here at McGill, as well as elsewhere in the country, is certainly world-class and puts us in a great position to be part of a market that serves 7 billion people versus a market for 37 million.
Well, in that regard, it is remarkable on a global scale how much work is being done, for instance, on vaccines, aside from testing. And I guess one of the challenges is, you did mention in your talk that we're seeing them being developed in phase 3 trials at a really unprecedented rate. But if and when a vaccine or vaccines become available, how do we ensure that people who need it get it? It would seem to me that the distribution is fraught with difficulties related to everything from politics to procurement. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Well, your observation is informed and corresponds with my naive understanding. But I think the multi-jurisdictional nature of distribution in our country, but also the fact that we may be dealing with multiple vaccines that have different measures of correlates of protection, because they may be targeting different parts of the immune system to protect. So that is a huge challenge, and this is something at the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force that we've been working with very closely with the Vaccines Task Force, and also something called the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, NACI. And this is an area where being clear on where the populations in need are, whether vaccines that are developed work for them, and how you would manage access to different types of population with different types of vaccines and measure safety and effectiveness once they're being deployed. That's a huge area for work, and Canada's not alone in not having it figured out, but we need to get that roadmap established quickly, responsibilities delegated, and learn from other countries that are facing the same challenge.
Well, thank you. This is not, as you said, there have been pandemics before. You mentioned the 1918 flu. So this is not the first global pandemic. It won't be the last. And part of the rationale of having school population global health, which we're very excited about, is to play an important role in dealing with major public health issues. And I wonder if you could just comment a bit on what the school is doing to prepare for future pandemics, help prevent them, and where that fits in the context of what other schools and countries are doing. Maybe it'll give you a chance to talk about some of the lessons we've learned from this pandemic.
Sure. Well, David, I would have to say a blind spot of public health and the health sector in general has been dealing with emergencies and uncertainty. And I would love to say that schools of population global health had all of this figured out a long time ago. The reality is they can do a lot better. And I think what we've seen in this pandemic is that the resource for that is latent. So if we look across McGill, the number of people that have come out of the woodwork to do first-class modeling, to test therapies, to develop new diagnostics, to work with local public health authorities, to do a whole inquiry into why long-term care facilities were so vulnerable. There's massive capacity to address the issues that are central to being better prepared and having a better capacity to respond. However, we haven't aligned those systematically. So one of the things that we'd like to do is build on that latent capacity and create a living lab for pandemic emergencies as part of the new school of population and global health. And with that, really bring a more disciplined approach to not only mobilizing knowledge before, during, and after crises, but also, very importantly, developing the professional and leadership competencies that are critical. And I think this is an area where the clarion couldn't be clearer or better heard. Our responsibility is to make sure we make good on the crisis and establish that as a defining part of the school in the coming year. And I couldn't be more excited about having that opportunity. It's just that I can tell you there's perhaps nothing more important for us to make good on in terms of a lesson from this pandemic.
Well, in that regard, we're thrilled that you're here to be running the school, but you're also the executive director of the Immunity Task Force. Maybe you want to just say a few words about what the task force is doing and how it's going.
Thanks, David. I should say that I'm not alone on the McGill front. I have a co-chair by the name of Catherine Hankins, who's an absolute fantastic a pandemic convert from her HIV specialty and specialization. But together with my other co-chair, David Naylor, and a great leadership group and provincial territorial representatives, we've been trying to understand both the nature of transmission by measuring levels of antibodies that can be found in the population, and also understand the nature of immunity. The levels, duration, the nature of protection. And we're 5 months into it. We have about 35 studies going across the country. We have initial results from blood banks, Canadian Blood Services and Quebec, where we've been humbled by the low levels of infection that were detected by measuring antibodies in the blood, but also encouraged by a huge surge in interesting research that is going to help us better understand not only basic questions with respect to immune function and immune protection and duration, but having that tailored to the realities of our country in terms of populations that are disproportionately at risk. And this includes Indigenous communities. We've just launched a request for proposals with respect to hotspots, the neighborhoods, the racialized minorities, the occupations, long-term care settings where we know vulnerability is greatest. And we're really looking forward to, over the next 2 years, understanding more about risk and transmission, but most importantly, whether understanding infection immunity through our research can help inform better strategies. This relates perhaps most importantly at this point to the opportunity that vaccine or vaccines have, and making sure that they're safely and effectively delivered to those who need them most. So it's a big agenda. We're not alone. We're working with other task force, the therapeutics task force, the vaccine task force, and hopefully we can deliver some value added with respect to improving things with respect to our opportunities to exit this epidemic safely and as soon as possible.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our program. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Merci à tous. I particularly want to thank our speaker, Tim Evans, for a really great presentation with enormous perspective on what is a very complex and very challenging problem. And I want to thank you for your generosity in providing us with this background, Tim. It was really great. And I hope to see you all again on campus when it becomes safe to meet in person. Until then, please stay safe, stay well, prenez soin de vous. Merci beaucoup.